Hey everyone, good morning. It's right at the top of the hour. We're gonna give everyone a few minutes here to log in and join the webinar. So good morning, everyone. Those of you just joining, we're gonna give everyone a few minutes here to get logged in and join, and then we'll get started. We'll get started in just another minute here. Let everyone try to get logged in, set up. Okay, well, good morning, everybody, and thank you for taking the time and joining us for the third in our four-part series webinar about denials and the use of AI and denials workflow. And thank you for taking the time this morning and spending it with us. I know you are all very busy. So let's get it started. Maybe. Real quick, before we get going, I think most of you who are on this know or should know who Aspirion is, but we're a tech-enabled revenue cycle management services business that focuses on multiple areas in the back end of the revenue cycle, specifically focused on collecting the most complex claims and plugging the holes where revenue leaks from our largest provider clients. And today we're going to spend our time, and we've been spending our time, I should say, along this continuum here of focusing very heavily on denials. And we spend a lot of time and a lot of the work we do here with my colleague, Jeff Podraza, and his world of denials is focused on these high dollar, complex clinical denials that require clinical validation. So they require medical records to be pulled and reviewed and then justified in how we're resolving them. And so we're going to spend time digging into that area of our wheel here and trying to share with you guys the insights that we've gained on our journey of using artificial intelligence in the world of denials and denials processes. So with that, I'm Jim Bohnsack. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at Aspirion. Been here about a year, spent 25 years in the healthcare and the revenue cycle and the technology space. And so I'm responsible for our M&A and our strategy and our product, our core product broadly. And I get to work with these great guys, Spencer, Jeff, and I will let them introduce themselves.
Yeah, hey everyone, Spencer Allee here. I'm our Chief AI Officer with Aspirion. I've been here a bit over a year at this point. My background is really in how we apply machine learning and artificial intelligence to knowledge-based processes. Prior to this role, focused on regulatory compliance and financial services and a number of other industries prior to that. So really excited to work on this problem space. There's a ton of opportunity, and it's a pleasure to work with Jim and Jeff. So I'll pass it over to you, Jeff.
Mute, Jeff.
Thank you. I told everybody I would do that. Good morning, everybody.
It's perfect. Good. On cue.
Yeah, I'm Jeff Podraza. I'm president and general manager of Aspirion's Denials division. I've been focused in denials resolution and prevention for almost a quarter century now. I have the benefit of supporting a lot of large healthcare systems across the country with denials resolution in there. And like I said, we're really excited to talk about what we've been focused on, and like Jim and Spencer are alluding to, our journey and making sure that, we used every available tool and capability to get peak denial resolution and to also push denial prevention.
All right. So as I mentioned, excited to have these guys here today. Spencer's been helping me along this journey here and sharing our insights. We began with an overview of applying AI and denials management so everybody can get grounded on what we're talking about when we talk about AI. Last month, we did account scoring and how we're using machine learning models to route and prioritize accounts for follow-up. Today, we're going to go deeper into how we're actually automating the workflow itself using large language models and other technology. And then our final one next month will include a good friend of mine and former colleague, Brad Tinnerman, who leads revenue cycle for Kaiser. And we want to get perspective from Brad sitting at the intersection of payer provider at Kaiser and what he thinks about the implications of this advanced technology and revenue cycle and more broadly. So we'll cap it off with that next month. All of these are recorded. So today's is recorded. The last couple have been recorded. They are on our website. The presentations are also on our website. And then the registration for next month is on our website. So love to have you guys join us for the kind of fireside chat with Brad and discussion on what he's seeing in this space. I don't know that I need to set too much of a framework for you guys in terms of what's going on in the market. You're all living it, but we are seeing a massive increase in the amount of denials and the speed with which the denials are being sent back by the payers. I actually believe that they're not really applying different rules and that they're applying them faster and more consistently with the use of technology. So they're outpacing the provider community in terms of their investment in technology, and specifically payment integrity is the catch-all bucket that investors like to talk about, and where the opportunity exists in reviewing claims upon claim adjudication to apply rules and then reject them quickly, whether it be for auths or on the back end for claim adjudication. So we're seeing that broadly across the market, massive growth in denials. And specifically in our world, where we're seeing the biggest pain point is not the front-end patient access denials where we make errors on registration. Rather, it's these high-dollar clinical denials that require clinical validation. And those are particularly problematic for the market in that we need certified coders, clinicians. We use 170 plus attorneys, plus nearly 100 clinicians to work those denials and resolve them. And we know the staffing is a problem. We know that the labor market shortages are challenging the entire provider community and industries broadly. And so getting that talent is problematic. And then the amount of increased workflow is problematic. And so how do we solve that with using the automation and using the technology? And that's what we're going to dig into today. So with that, Spencer, you want to give them a perspective on what we're talking about when we talk about AI and large language models?
Yeah, thanks, Jim. So if we think about, AI as a broad term, there's a lot of different things that go into that bucket. We went a little bit deeper on that in the first session. But when we think about, workflow acceleration, efficiency, proficiency in this process, what's different now and why are we talking about this? it's really because of large language models. So, folks have probably heard the phrase if they've, if you've played with ChatGPT at all, or some of these others, Google Gemini, are examples of this. But LLMs, as they're known, are really kind of a new step change in the capability of machine learning and AI to actually impact these knowledge-based and really language-based workflows. So a lot of the information that was previously bound up in unstructured text is now more and more and more accessible. You can think of large language models, I won't get too technical, but you can think of them as basically big machine learning models that were essentially trained on the whole internet. That's the easiest way to think about it. So, you can imagine that's many, many, many terabytes of data that they've learned language patterns in, and now can both, more easily and accurately retrieve relevant information from large amounts of text. And then also, as folks have seen, playing with it themselves or in the news, generate very high fidelity text based on simple prompts from users. So this is really the kind of keystone to what's unlocking a lot more opportunities for us in this space.
Yeah, and so I appreciate that, Spencer. As we think about these large language models and the revenue cycle flow, there's a ton, well, broadly in healthcare, there are a ton of applications for the use of these large language models to drive efficiency and effectiveness in workflow. But even in the revenue cycle, when you start to narrow it down there and talk about the front, middle, and back, there are many applications where these things can be applied and improve operations and efficiency and throughput and address our staffing challenges. And on the front end, there's been, scheduling optimization businesses. There's certainly patient chatbots answering questions about wayfinding and getting somewhere, and appointment reminders and prior authorization automation, and how do we extract the right information to get the answers, or get the answers to the questions to get an authorization approved. I think it's really fascinating in the mid-cycle, some of the advancements that are happening around ambient listening and capturing information in a clinical visit so that the notes can be created, trying to address physician burnout, capture more accurate, robust information about the history of disease and other things through that conversation, and then applying that to CDI queries and coding automation. So how do we automate the coding of a medical record using unstructured text to structure it and then flow it through to generating a claim? And on the back end, patient pay models and predictive models around patient payments have been out there for some time. I think they've advanced materially. And what we're going to talk about, what we talked about, was modeling for denial predictability in our last webinar. And today we're going to talk about how we're using this technology to begin to automate the appeals process. So we'll dig into that. And with that, let's get into specifically the Aspirion use case, and I'll turn it back to Spencer, and he can kind of walk us through how we thought about that.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. So, even on that last side, you saw that there were lots and lots of different applications, and that was just a small kind of sample of use cases. A theme that we're going to be talking about throughout this is the need to really focus in on where specifically are you applying this technology, and how are you applying it with the process you have today and the people you have today to really create a real impact. I think throughout my career in machine learning and AI, there's often been this kind of myth or desire to just kind of, I call it, sprinkle machine learning on top of it and hope that it works. But that doesn't really work. It's all about where in the flow of the business process today do you actually intervene and interject, and what are the inputs and the outputs to that? So as we thought strategically about what makes the most sense for us, we started, as Jim mentioned, with clinical appeals specifically, because there's so much information and text bound up in that process, and it's very time consuming, very complicated. It can be very error prone. And this is the exact type of use case where large language models and solutions that are powered by large language models can actually make a real difference. So, for us, you can kind of see on the left side here, it's very small, but that's basically our logical flow of our clinical denials process, or generating an appeal letter for clinical denial. So it's very complicated. There's a lot of logic in there, and there's really kind of one part of that where we have started on our journey to automate and accelerate with large language models. And that's where we have clinical documentation, we have clinical guidelines, payer policies, managed care agreements. All of these are critical inputs that our experts today use, and I know Jeff can talk more about this, but our experts today use to craft the right argument based on the denial type in order to maximize our overturn rate for our clients. And we take those as inputs along with the claim information in the medical record, and then we generate an appeal letter, basically, is the output. There's a little bit more nuance there, but that's basically what we're doing. And so the question, kind of the problem statement, if you will, today is how do we take these inputs and outputs and augment our process today with these large language models? So I don't know, Jim, if you want to talk a little bit more about how you think about this, and then Jeff, I know we were chatting earlier about all these different inputs.
Yeah, Jeff, how did you think about this when we started this journey to dig down into kind of the work that gets done in your world and how we focus specifically on this?
Well, I think Spencer touched on something that's really important when we talk about this big umbrella that everybody calls AI, because initially, Spencer, as you'll recall, as we've been on this journey early on, there was a thought we could just take tons of the data and bring it in overall, and what you call just sprinkle ML on it. And the data is so dynamic and complex that you really need to say, well, where are we going to start highly focused? And as an attorney myself, and as Jim mentioned, Aspirion with a critically large group of attorneys, our guiding ethos is always, what we were all taught in law school, a methodology called IRAC, which is issue, rule, analysis, and conclusion. And so when we look at these models, we think about, well, one, we got to be spot on with the actual issue or the discrete root cause of the denial type to go through. And then this is where, when we talk about the rules of the road coming in, and when you look at it in this instance, on a clinical appeal, some of the heaviest lifting we're going to do is the clinical validation, the clinical justification phase. And that's where a lot of our efforts are focused right now. In addition to that, though, and why we put on here the various inputs, and what our team specializes at Aspirion in is bringing together not just the clinical validation aspect, which is critical on there, but when we mention payer policy, regulation, contractual aspects, to see how these all get integrated. And that's really where we're driving the phase. But to do that, we're building the first level function. And it's super important for anybody in this, is you're just not going to just send a model wild, because this is where I've spent my time with Spencer to help me understand how, everybody say, oh, we can train the model. And I have like a layman's concept of AI overall and large language models. I think algorithmically, Spencer, I think you can touch on, though, that, the power of the models is that they can actually build on their algorithms versus having, human coders, programmers come in and do it. With that, I know Spencer's going to touch on how you corral this overall. But, from my thought process is we wanted to drive the most value to support our professionals in what is very serious work and time-consuming work, and going through and, like I said, bringing all the rules together and then approaching the clinical validation phase.
Yeah, that's really, Jeff, is, as we started looking at this, you had a combination of very, highly, specialized resources with deep knowledge that are, doing, I get the rationalizing, to your point, using your model, what's the issue and what are the rules applied to it. But it's in a very referenced way, look at the, clinical documentation, look at the denial first. What's the denial by code? What's the diagnosis and procedure combination within that claim that was submitted? How did the payer respond to it? And, are there specific guidelines around, be it millimeter or interqual, that define what is, appropriate care for that type of diagnosis. And then furthermore, but then is there a payer policy that's specifically referenced there for that specific payer around that specific case type that you got to look at? And then, oh my gosh, what does the managed care agreement also say? And fascinating that you guys use all of those different reference materials to build your case and argument. And so one of the things I would highlight on here, and again, these are highly specialized resources that are, not inexpensive to employ and to retain and are doing really good work. How can you make their job easier to allow them to apply their knowledge, in a more regimented way, and then work on the edge cases as they come up, to then further train the model, to your point, so that it knows, it incorporates for the next one those edge cases now that they're included. So bringing all that together, we would say this is about writing the appeal letter. Well, there's a lot of work steps in there to do just that. And it's not just that work step. So I think, in our flow, we got very granular around, expensive cost of input, resources, time, big implications for our clients, high dollar accounts, right? Complex claims that need to be resolved to get them paid for the work that they did. And so how do you bring together all that reference information, tie it all into one platform, and then begin to automate that so that it can learn over time? I mean, that's where we spent a lot of time, and we'll highlight later, you got to do that kind of work to get down to that very, sub-step of the workflow to be able to apply this in a logical and useful way, quite honestly. So with that, Spencer, you want to take them through what exactly we did and what we're doing today?
Yeah, I'd love to. So, and this is really the beginning of our journey, I would say. So I expect we'll continue to update, our friends in the market as we continue to build. But this is kind of a snapshot of, the first step that we're taking on this journey. So what you're seeing here is a screenshot of what we call Aspirion's DocIQ platform. And DocIQ platform, it's called DocIQ because it's really a way to extract this intelligence or information from documents, right? So everything we just referred to, medical records, contracts, guidelines, policies, regulation, all of these largely exist in PDFs or websites or other documents, rather than, being programmatically available. So, what we're doing is building an LLM powered platform that lets us do that. So I'm just going to walk through 3 of the kind of initial key features here, and we could talk a little bit more about where we're going from here. But, to begin with is, and this is probably the most important, is our AI generated summary. So, I mentioned earlier with large language models, there are kind of 2 big use cases. One is generating text. You can ask ChatGPT to write you a poem in such style of Shakespeare or whatever. But it's also, there's a pattern called retrieval augmented generation, or RAG. Not to get too technical, but if you hear the term a RAG model in the context of LLMs, this is what we're talking about, which is really about how do you take a discrete document or set of documents, ask it natural language questions, and get very accurate answers back that are not kind of hallucinating. So you may have heard the term hallucination with regard to large language models, which means the model is creating language that sounds like it's correct, but it's not actually correct. And this approach, RAG, or retrieval augmented generation, is kind of a technical approach to minimize that and extract real information from documents. And so that's what we have here on the left panel here of the screenshot. Is we have a standard set of key questions that get applied to every medical record that come in, that just extracts the key information that a nurse or an attorney would normally ask themselves as they start to parse through a medical record and try to understand the story of that patient in that encounter. And so, this is a way to just accelerate that understanding of the kind of holistic medical record and that narrative of what happened. So that's kind of the first summary, or first key feature here is that summary. Second one, fully digitized and searchable document. This may sound small, and depending on if you're a provider you know, if your EHR already has everything digitized, this may not seem like a big deal. But for folks that are dealing with PDFs that may be scanned or may not already be digitized, you know, these PDFs of medical records can be thousands of pages long. And if they're not easily searchable, then it's very, very onerous to get through that whole document and figure out exactly where the right information is. Kind of not, I think maybe it was Jim or somebody said, it's not a needle in a haystack, it's a needle in a pile of needles. So being able to search effectively is actually really important. And so that's something we can do with machine learning is we can digitize the whole document using OCR, optical character recognition, make it super searchable. And then finally, automated extraction of document taxonomy and bookmarks. So there's a little link there in the corner. You can see kind of a bookmark icon that would actually take you to a different kind of screen or, you know, left bar here that shows you kind of the index of the whole document. So you can quickly jump to key sections. So you can navigate that way. So, you know, a couple of key points here. One is, as you can tell, this is still very much a human in the loop process, right? So we're taking large language models and we're using that to build a better tool for our clinicians, for our attorneys, so that they can spend less of their time trying to navigate a document or just read a document and more of their time actually in that kind of analysis phase that Jeff was referring to of, you know, what is the actual synthesis of the information here so I can, you know, make that appeal argument both faster but also better, right? You know, they're much less likely to miss any information. You can see patterns within the document and focus more of your energy there and operate at the top of your license. So that's kind of key point number one. And the other key point to me is this is just scratching the surface. I mean, and we'll talk about this more on a couple more slides, but this is like the, you know, very much the first iteration of what we can do with these large language models. Even these questions themselves, right now, these are basically a uniform set of questions across all medical records. These, you know, part of our roadmap is making these specific to denial type and you know, what is coming in on the 837 or the claim form, so that we can have very specific key questions based on that pull out the most relevant information right away. And then that in turn will start to enable more and more acceleration and automation and proficiency gains for the team. So I'll pause there. Maybe Jim, Jeff, how are you thinking about this as kind of our first step, and what are you guys hearing from the teams?
Well, Spencer, I have to think well of it since this is an area of focus that we all drove. But no, the initial feedback from our clinicians and other team members is super positive. That are using it. And so, of course, today we're just sharing a snippet and a screenshot to go through. And like I said, there was a lot of considerate thought in structuring how we would query clinical documentation. And so, Spencer, I know that's what you're covering in the preset to get it all together. That in itself is very useful for a professional who has to go in. And like I was citing about, the analysis phase is really the heavy lifting phase to go through. And so it's twofold, because I always approach this first, does it make us better? Meaning, are we going to improve accuracy? And the answer to that is yes, meaning to surface the information, there's certainly an efficiency gain that we're doing it fast, but as Spencer was going through here, so the team members that are in the loop with this can immediately go to the reference sections of the document to validate the summaries and the information that has been surfaced. Another critically important part to this is when, you know, Spencer, you're covering that, we've already defined preset queries overall, and we will continue to develop those. But really the power of this is when everybody that's with us today, when you think about structured analysis, this is the way to capture what people who already are veterans at going through and interrogating clinical documentation to support the care is billed. The free form queries themselves, that's the way to get the structured analysis into the system. So we can start to build the pattern recognition when people are going in, depending on when we have the summarized data around the rationale, the condition of the patient, what are medical professionals coming in and looking to validate on? And so this is really something when we talk about how do you pull this off, you need a system like this to go to the next step, because this is where I know, Spencer, you're going to touch on humans in the loop right now are really guiding this so the system can increase its validity, its accuracy overall. So, but like I said, I mean, it's getting great reviews from our team as we deployed it.
Yeah, I think this thing's so awesome. And yes, highlight that point that this is just the foundation, but it allows us to capture the questions and the queries that are being applied and build the library over time. And I think just the simple fact that, to your point, Jeff, you mentioned it, but you can look on the left bar right when you get in and you can jump to that specific citation within that record to say, did it pull it correctly? Is this what it's really saying? Is there more context around it I need to see? I mean, just that navigation and the multi-thousand page medical records that somebody has to sift through to pull that information out, and this being able to do it repeatedly is awesome. All right, Spencer. So we've started the foundation, and here's where we are with Doc IQ. Kind of where, we want to give everyone a snapshot of where we're going from here. So you take us through that, what that looks like, that evolution.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is kind of the framework of how we think about it, going from bottom to top here. So if you think about what do you need to actually achieve this, automation and acceleration and proficiency gains and all the things we've talked about, and where do people often start? And I would add that this framework is not just about RCM. This is kind of any knowledge-based business process. Often, you start in an ad hoc kind of workflow where there aren't standardized processes. Maybe there's some kind of documentation about how it should go, but it's often, managed individually based on individual managers, working out of spreadsheets or whatever it is. And that's kind of your most inefficient, but often your baseline case when you don't have technology to help you standardize and then accelerate as you go. So that's the bottom row there. And if you look across kind of from left to right, these are you can think about this as a very stylized set of capabilities across that denials management process. So triaging accounts, reviewing payer policies, clinical review of the clinical information, review pricing information, and ultimately write that appeal letter. Obviously, tons of complexity within each of these steps, as we touched on earlier, but that's one way to think about it. So if you're starting from that ad hoc place, then moving up the maturity curve, even before you get to any kind of artificial intelligence, you want to start by standardizing your workflow. So what are the business rules that you use and apply with a workflow system to route the right accounts to the right place, to the right desk? And then how is that review actually coordinated and routed, throughout each step of the process so that the right data is available to the expert at the right time? And then finally, in our use case, when you're writing an appeal, even without AI, often teammates will have appeal letter templates based on the denial type or the diagnosis code or the, kind of the most common scenarios that they see that they can use that we know work because of the volume of cases that we deal with each and every year. So you can think of that as kind of the baseline case without AI. And then we move up into the human in the loop automation kind of row there. And this is where I'd say we are today as Aspirion. So, we touched on it last month around scoring models, but how do you use not just business rules, but also probabilistic machine learning in order to, prioritize the right cases to maximize yield for our clients, right? So that's the business rules and scoring models. And then what we've been talking about and highlighting today is how do you use large language models and AI to assist in that manual review process, and then take system actions that are triggered based on where the account is in the life cycle, the reason it was denied, what the most recent action or touch was from our team, and so on, to really, again, take as many of the kind of manual steps that don't require a lot of thoughtful analysis out of the process and let our experts really focus on the kind of creative problem solving that they're really hired to do, right? So that's that human in the loop process. Ultimately, generating an appeal letter, that's kind of an LLM assisted appeal letter. That's something we're working on right now. But the reason it's human in the loop is because every time we process a claim, as we've touched on, or process a denial, we want the system and the models to then learn from that. So, um, in the medical record example we saw in the prior slide, those questions will pull out relevant information, and then that relevant information will go into an appeal letter. And that appeal letter will then go back into our training data set, and the model will get better at pulling out the most relevant information for those denial types, for those payers, for those diagnosis and procedure combinations, so that this gets more and more accurate over time. And ultimately, that's what leads you to kind of the top row here, which is really where you can think of this as kind of the end state that we will never quite totally get to, but we'll get closer and closer to, right? Which is human on the loop automation. And in this state, rather than for each account, an expert touching that every single account as it goes through and correcting it or doing part of that process, really in this state, the system is doing everything or almost everything. And then the system will detect when there is a complexity threshold that's exceeded or a quality threshold that's not met. And then those accounts will get kicked out to our experts, who will actually then, do the process on that smaller percentage of accounts, as well as sampling from the process on an ongoing basis to ensure overall quality. But at that point, you really are getting to the point where, the factory is automated, and then there's a quality team that's kind of spot checking things, right? And that's where you kind of maximize the efficiency and proficiency of this whole system, and get to a point where you're actually solving some big problems in the space, right? So that's really the pie in the sky, but that's where we kind of are going aspirationally. In the meantime, really driving big gains and kind of that human in the loop process.
Yeah, and I wouldn't understate the fact that, Jeff had standardized workflow already. So a lot of foundational work there to have some very talented people doing consistent approaches across that flow that allowed us to then effectively codify that and build that into the DocIQ platform and continue to build that in the platform, which is a huge jumping off point for us, excited me. And then, not to understate, and I don't know if people have, if you've got questions, please put them in. We'll have time at the end for questions. But I mean, we're talking about 9 dedicated PhD data scientists and 12 advanced degree machine learning engineers working on DocIQ full time, all day, every day. And it's great to have those folks that are ridiculously smart and well versed in the use of large language models and other technologies to do this automation. But it takes coordination with Jeff's team and these subject matter experts, and it takes the data flow that was already in place, where we were getting medical records, and we've got care guidelines, and we've got managed care agreements, and we've got payer policies being pulled. So it's that whole combination that allows us to move up this chain, and I'm excited to keep expanding and pushing it. Jeff, your perspective on this journey.
Yeah, well, I mean, by nature, I'm resistant to change. Meaning that we know, we built something that we know that it works. It produces high quality results overall. So that's what I mean. I'm a stickler to how can we actually improve what's very good right now to go through, but we're doing it with a team of professionals all the time. And so like we want to have a force multiplier for the professionals, and backing all the way up to what, we touched on in the previous series about predictive and probability modeling, which is very important and has a lot of utility to it. But this is where we're at right now. And I know everyone that's with us today, it's the then what phase. I mean, I was on a Becker's panel 2 years ago where one of the participants, the panelists, said we can predict a denial with 86% probability accuracy. What do we do after that? And so that's really, I don't mean to make it too base, but that's where we are now. We really are in the then what phase going through this. And as we're on our own journey, what we're not sharing today, I'm sure a lot of people are like, well, we were hoping this gang was going to say, do you have a robot to deploy that's just going to spit out tons of high quality appeals for us? The answer to that is the way we're working on it, and Jim and Spencer have touched on, we're taking our veteran team members and we're in the early phases on the appeal generation on highly focused use cases where we know that we can structure it appropriately, as an example, for a DRG downgrade with sepsis, where we have a lot of rules that we can put into a framework. And the initial results on that are quite impressive, meaning that the people who do it every single day, who do the clinical encoding validation, would rank it at 90% plus accuracy going through. And so when I know all of us are in this journey together right now, at your respective systems or organizations, that's really the question is like, are you going to deploy this highly focused so you don't start doing output that just destroys your credibility overall? And so, that's of utmost importance to us, is to maintain, like I said, a very high level of accuracy when we make these arguments. Another phase here too, when you think about how you're going to put this all together, and this is something, that we touched on early on where, Spencer said you just don't sprinkle ML on everything. You do have to have the right data to go through. And I mean, Aspirion as an organization has a critically large data set of very good appeals. And so the ability to go in, and that's really our next phase, is when we talk about review pair policy overall, when we want to take a look at controlling regulation, we want to look at language in managed care agreements to pull in. That's a really big task to structure all that in a data set, table it all out, when literally we already have had team members spending years accessing that information, integrating it into appeals. That this is really the utility of large language models, is to somewhat back into that as well too. And this is an area, where, Spencer, I've gone back and forth with you, and I think you can describe to the group where you need to be very thoughtful and careful about that too, when everybody's looking at their existing pile of data today, and how can you really extract useful information to drive to the generative phase.
Well, let's talk about, that's awesome. Thank you, Jeff. Let's talk about how we are measuring kind of our success in that world. And I know it's partly Spencer, and then it's partly Jeff. So Spencer, you want to start with the top?
Yeah, I think at a recent leadership team meeting, we talked about this in the context of a relay race, and how, there's building the tech and the models and how that works, and then how do you make sure that handoff is smooth so that it's really driving actual impact and benefit, ultimately for our clients. And so I think a lot about all of these, but especially this top two. So model metrics and then user operator behavior in our systems. We, as Jeff said, quality is super important to us. And there are different ways of measuring quote unquote accuracy for large language models. That's still kind of an area of active research, but in the frameworks that we use, our threshold bar is very high. It's 95% or really even higher, 99% for a lot of use cases. So that's kind of where we need to land for this to really be effective for people, because as Jeff said, our value add to our clients is quality, right? So that's where we kind of start with. And then we go to, okay, the models are working. Are we seeing our users and our operators adopt it? And is that adoption actually helping them in their day-to-day, right? So that's where we want to see that the actual clinical review step efficiency is improving. And, folks feel like this is now an indispensable part of their toolbox. And even in that just kind of first MVP release that we talked about earlier, our initial results are looking like a 20 to 30% improvement as a baseline on reviewing medical record speed, with just the ability to navigate it better and have some of that key information pulled out. So that's a pretty significant improvement, for that initial release. And then that gets into the operational KPIs and client benefits that I'll let Jeff talk to.
I mean, just the efficiency gains alone. Like I said, I mean, proficiency is paramount. But if we can deploy even more proficiency because of the efficiency gains, it's a huge win to go through. I mean, I know for a fact everybody with us today understands that denials have increased over the last 4 years significantly. And as Aspirion has scaled as an organization, and we continue to successfully resolve more and more denials, it's very important for us to do it as efficiently as possible after applying that proficiency. In terms of the benefits of that, like I said, the first, just as the ability is to triage, treat, and successfully resolve more denials from a scale perspective with the same size resource overall. And then in terms of what I would just call overall benefits, where you're able to take more through the model going through, and then literally incremental gains. And I'll touch on the fact that, I mean, what we've seen increase over the last 4 years in the denial world are, what I would consider patient service denials, inpatient versus outpatient, inpatient downgrades. And even with that rise overall, where the battleground is justifying the inpatient level of care, we've seen that if you can just move that incrementally, if you can take your success rate there by 2, 3, 4 basis points, it translates into millions of dollars of revenue overall. And so, like I said, we're always going to start with the proficiency and the accuracy, because we know the net result is that any movement at all that, in this case, we are ensuring that we're securing as much as possible at the inpatient level of care. It has huge financial benefit to it.
Thank you, guys. All right, well, we got a couple more, and then we're going to tie this out, and we're going to take some questions here. But we've done this in the past, so I'm going to walk through the framework that we've used here with the 4 puzzle pieces as you think about applying this type of framework within your organization. As we said, be very specific about defining your use cases. What is that sub work step that you can apply this to? And does it have the characteristics around use of logical data and arguments to speed the efficiency using things like large language models? The second thing you got to ask yourself is, Jeff pointed it out, we have a massive amount of data, and we have a massive amount of historical data and those cases where appeals have been sent and successfully overturned a denial. And so that leads to us being able to structure that and inform these large language models so that they have predictive capabilities and high accuracy, as we pointed out. In addition to that, you got to think about what platform you're going to use. And Spencer alluded to it early. You've heard of, GPT, GPT-4 now. You've heard of those models. There's many of them, right? There are many different platforms out there, and they're continuously being developed. And there's a variety of different flavors of those platforms and differences in what they're good at, right? And so understanding their capabilities, the corpus of information that they were trained on as foundational large language models, and then what's needed with your data to fine tune them and what they're going to be better at handling is all important considerations going into that. And it's not an easy task. And lastly, I think the talent is really important. And it's not just as we think about, our number of PhD data scientists. It's not just our machine learning engineers. It's also our broader engineering team related to, extracting the data, getting the data in our workflow of Compass that we use to standardize our workflows across all of our service lines. Those folks are involved. But even more importantly, I would say you've got folks that are the subject matter experts on Jeff's team that have this knowledge about this workflow and the steps that need to be taken and how the cases are built, and translating those into this technology to make it useful and to be able to use it and gain these, 30% efficiency and just, navigating through. So it's this combination of all of those resources that have to be, involved, available, and paying attention to this and bought in, quite frankly. And then there's other, wraparound project management resources and change management because it's got workflow implications, all of those things that I would say, if you're not thinking about this holistically, it's going to be a challenge, right? And you're going to, fits and starts and those kind of things. So tying all that together, I think as we end this, the questions that I would pose that you need to ask yourself as you think about how AI gets applied in the healthcare is, one is, do we have the capital to invest in this, right? The being in the health system, hospital delivery, provider delivery world is not exactly a highly profitable, high margin business. And so do we have the capital allocated to invest in a journey like this? The second is, if we've got the capital, do we have the capability? Do we have all of those different types of resources that I just mentioned within our organization to allow us to take on a project like this? And even if we've got the capital and the capability, do we have the capacity? Because again, I mentioned at the beginning, it's not for a lack of use cases where this type of automation can be applied in healthcare, and it can be in care delivery, right? It can be in transportation. It can be in all sorts of things. And so if we've got the capital, if we've got the capability, do we have the capacity to, work on revenue cycle management optimization? And then do we have the commitment? We've mentioned, this is not just a silver bullet. Here's the new technology, one and done, apply it, sprinkle ML across our workflow, and it'll just make magic results. It doesn't work like that. So this is a total journey where you got to manage the model, you've got to refine the model, you've got to advance the model, you've got to expand the use cases, you have to do all of those things. So it's all big questions to ask yourselves, but then I think the real question we have to ask is, like, do we have a choice? Payers are investing in this at a much faster clip than we are as providers. We feel important that we as Aspirion servicing providers and being provider-centric is that we invest on behalf of our providers. It helps us, it helps you, it helps deliver results. And we are paid only on delivering results. So, but do you guys have a choice? And where do you start? All of those questions I think are super important. And all of those questions we'll push and ask, Mr. Tinnerman next month how he thinks about those things. So with that, let's take a couple questions. We've got about 8-10 minutes left, and a couple of questions. If at the end of this, I will point out, I'll be in deep trouble by our marketing team if I don't say there's a survey at the end of this. So please do me a favor and give us feedback. We love to get the feedback. We love to hear additional questions. We're happy to reach out and follow up on anything that we don't get to. So please fill out that survey, drop in questions, send us questions. Again, this stuff is on our website. The QR code there will allow you to get there and register for the next one. And so let's start with a question here that's come in, and we've been hearing about it. We've been talking about it. Everybody's talking about it. Epic has announced that they are going to apply AI and they're going to release AI in their payer provider portal at the end of this year. And that's going to help automate appeals and help improve appeal workflow and those kind of things. And so I'm paraphrasing the question there. I'm going to start and I'm going to pass it to you guys, but I think Spencer said it well, that AI isn't everything we do today. It's in your, predictive text, in your, as you're typing a text message on your iPhone, it's in your email correcting stuff. It's everywhere, and it's gonna be everywhere. And I love Epic for doing it because I think they are in the best position to drive even more automation, more efficiency, and they sit at the intersection of holding a lot of data that goes from the provider to the payer. And so it's important that we're advancing that and taking expense out of the system. So with all that being said, just providing the tool itself and the technology doesn't drive the efficiency in the workflow. So again, it has to be trained, it has to be tuned, it has to be specific to specific use cases, it has to be further refined. There's change management associated with it. There's subject matter expertise, they got to be available, all of these things. So I'm happy that we're advancing the use of AI, and Epic should be doing it because they are the market leader in the EMR space. but there's still too many questions in my mind about what does that mean and what impact might it have. Jeff, I don't know what you're very close
Well,
to this, but what do you think
we,
about it?
yeah, this has come up multiple times. I have the good fortune of speaking with a lot of providers, a lot of health systems. And over the last few months, this has been a topic coming on. And I'm a huge worry ward. So my initial reaction was, oh, there goes my business overall. But then knowing what we've done overall, I know it's just not going to flip a switch. I mean, the reality is that, I shared with Spencer early on that the first public versions of ChatGPT, my team went out immediately and started to feed ChatGPT with a series of questions that we ask new candidates overall. One, it's basically cognitive critical thinking exercises. But it is centered, of course, in the world we swim in, which are clinical denials and, trying to integrate just the thought process around that. Chat GPT has failed every single question multiple times. We keep putting it through. We believe we know because out in the public database, there tends to be a lot of payer-centric material available. But that was something I always, took saying, okay, I know that what the team has done with publicly available GPT models that we use to screen candidates, and we wouldn't hire ChatGPT today overall. That's why Spencer and team have been on a highly focused journey to make sure that we're actually doing stuff that we know are accretive to our success.
Yeah, that's hilarious. I wouldn't hire him. Spencer, a question that came in, I think for you is how many denials does it take to train an LLM up to the point where it can fully automate?
Yeah, it's a good question. It depends a lot on the denial type and the complexity of the argument that goes into the appeal generation. So, Jeff referenced earlier DRG downgrades with sepsis. That's in the grand scheme of things a relatively straightforward process because there's a very clear set of criteria that we make our clinical arguments at least based on. And yeah, I would say traditionally in machine learning, like in scoring models, for example, when you really are trying to learn deep patterns in data, you want, tens of thousands of examples at least, if not hundreds of thousands or millions. One of the advantages of large language models is they've already been trained on human language and, the data set of the internet, right? So what we're really doing is two things. One is called prompt engineering, which is how do you kind of pull out the right information from these models based on the questions that you ask them. And then the other is fine tuning, which is how do you take a large language model that is, generic to human language and then instead focus it on a very specific, domain. And in that case, you can start to get relatively accurate, models for appeal letters for some of these simpler denial types, with a couple hundred examples where you can really start pulling those out, even less for kind of prototypes. But then the devil is in the details once you get into more of those complex cases. Jeff referenced IP to OP downgrades. There are lots of different diagnosis and procedure code combinations. There are lots of different settings for that in different states with different payers. And so you get to the point where you really do need even if for any given use case, you don't need a tremendous amount of information for that body of complexity across all these different combinations, you really do need to have the volume that an Aspirion or other similar providers have to make those accurate, at least if you want to get to kind of fully automation, if that makes sense.
Oh, helpful. Thank you. Let's do one more question. And Jeff, this one's for you. How about focus on preventing denials versus solving denials? This one is very much about denial resolution, which we know because we've been handed it and it's our job to get it overturned. But then I think you guys do a very good job, speak to denial patterns and denial prevention and working with your clients to say, here's payer behavior that we've now noticed that's creating a trend where X payer is now denying for lack of authorization for a specific procedure. you guys do that well, but that denial prevention side, talk a little bit about your
This
perspective.
is one of the things that I'm most focused on going through in the terms of we can provide a lot of qualitative feedback today, but it is this investment to go through and to be able to bring the quantifiable piece of it going through. And as we touched on, when we look at something like inpatient downgrades, it's critical for us in 2024 to come in and be able to aggregate at least the biggest call outs. And that's the prevention phase overall, where you start to do true pattern recognition, where you have all the similar coded claims together. And it sounds, from my perspective, and I swim in data all the time, it sounds really easy. But that is really the driving benefit to go through when you look at deploying large language models, is to start to aggregate very like data sets together. So then you can put the two together. You can provide the qualitative feedback, but you're backing it up with a quantifiable group that you can approach, the payer community with, your major payers, and point out the opportunities to calibrate so you don't have to get that denial in the first place.
Awesome. All right. With that, we're going to wrap it up. So you all will see a survey as soon as we end this, and we really would appreciate the feedbacks. And we want to thank you guys again for being here. And a reminder that you can register for the final session on this and a perspective from Brad Tinnerman at Kaiser next month on our website. So with that, I appreciate you two, my colleagues, Spencer and Jeff, being here and sharing their perspectives. And we'll see you guys next month.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.